Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, my friend? How are you?
Chilling, man. As per usual. How about yourself?
I can't complain. It is windy as hell here in New York. But I think that's across the entire...
windy, huh?
What's that?
Flipping plains windy. Plains windy, huh?
Well, that was in Minnesota.
Yeah, but still.
But yeah, I mean, that's just like the entire country right now. The Midwest and the Northeast is just having crazy windstorms. How's the weather in Puerto Rico?
Fucking gorgeous as usual. And I will remind everyone who likes to ask me why I live in Puerto Rico because there's hurricanes here to remember that I don't get gale force winds that flip planes. So there's that.
Well, you do get storms that take out your power grid.
That's true. But the power grid also goes out
that's the
on
power
a bright,
grid. That's not the
sunny...
storm.
The power grid goes out on a sunny day. So I wouldn't necessarily blame the wind on that one.
Well, let's get started. So
right.
We are talking, this is going to be a different type of episode, and I'll just give you the background. So a couple of months ago, I got sick, and what I did, I was bedridden for, 2 weeks or so. And what I did was I caught up on anime. And I had not watched anime before that since I was a kid. There was like maybe a couple of series that I watched. Like I think I watched Death Note like 10 years ago or 12 years ago.
Dragon Ball Z.
But besides that, I had not watched any anime in many years.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, you know what? This is a time to catch up to see what all the what's Gen Alpha and Gen Z watching.
Mm-hmm.
And I went on a binge, and I watched like 9 different shows or something like that, or 8 different shows, and I got addicted. And I started watching a show called Attack on Titan.
On my recommendation, I might add.
On your recommendation. And at first I was like, and just heads up. So if you have any interest in watching this show, just stop listening to this episode because it's going to be extremely spoiler heavy. We're going to be talking about the plot and like the constructs and the meaning of the show, because it actually blends really well with what we talk about, week by week. So I watched this show and I was like, oh, it's a monster show. Okay, I get it. It's an interesting concept. It's kind of like, it's like a monster show about people being eaten by, titans or giants. And there's like a mystery element too, kind of like Lost.
Mm-hmm.
And then the show kind of slowly develops into this like political show.
Yep. That
not only like hits on really the topic of like ethnic violence, it hits on it better than basically any show I've watched, or like any piece of like fiction I've watched, period. Like it just does a really good job.
It does,
showing like the concept of the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just, we have to talk about this on a podcast because it's because I just need, first and foremost, I need a vent. I need to talk to somebody about it.
Yeah.
And I have no other friends I can talk about it with.
Except for all the people who listen to the show, right?
Yeah. I figured we could just record it and put it up as an episode and capture that young audience who's looking for content on that show, right?
Right. Let's see if this grows the user base or contracts it.
Or people are like, what the fuck did you just put out? Why are you talking about cartoons?
I promise it's relevant. It's relevant.
So what do we do? Like, do we, I mean, we don't need to, I imagine the people listening to this are people who watch the show, so we don't need to break down the plot, do we?
Well, we will, but I think as it relates to specific concepts, but so maybe we can, I really want to go into the otherness idea, because this show really, really, highlights that us versus them, that other, that enemy concept that's just kind of so pervasive in a lot of the geopolitics that we talk about. So, pretty much humans have always needed an enemy, and not just like a vague threat, but a very clear and defined other, something to rally against, to justify violence, to create a sense of unity, And history is full of these examples. We've talked about so many over the years on this show. I mean, Cold War had the Red Scare. Nazi Germany created, or at least very much expanded on the Jewish scapegoat idea. The U.S. had the War on Terror, and the questions that Attack on Titan brings up, or the themes, is really crazy, and it raises a lot of questions to me, like, what if war isn't just about defense? Like, what if it's about identity, and what if a society needs an enemy to function? And this is, I think, one of the crucial themes in Attack on Titan. And interestingly, it's also a central idea in the work of Carl Schmitt, who is a German political theorist and an unrepentant Nazi, who argued that politics is fundamentally about the distinction between friend and enemy. And so Schmitt believed that without the external threat, a society would turn on itself, and that true power lies with whoever has the ability to decide who the enemy is. And if you think about it, if you think about Attack on Titan, that sounds really, really familiar. So I figured in this episode, we could break down how Attack on Titan plays with the idea of the other, and how the series constantly shifts who the enemy is, and how it reflects like real world propaganda and political control. Because, I feel like as much as we would like to believe that we're evolved past the need for enemies, I think its history suggests otherwise.
Well, why don't we just break down, like, I give a quick synopsis on this for the people who are like, I don't give a shit. I'll listen to the episode. I don't plan on watching the shit series. Just give you a heads up. This is like the last spoiler warning. So Attack on Titan is a Japanese manga series, and it's by Hajime Isayama. And it was published back in 2009. And the plot is that there's these people behind a wall, and then they're attacked by these big monsters, and then there's this mystery element, like, who are these monsters? Like, what is the truth? And then slowly, the main characters figure out, that their government is not being truthful about, they know more about this than they're leading on to. And then I'll just kind of skip ahead. What ends up happening is that they find out the truth. The truth is that they are, in fact, a persecuted ethnic group that essentially is being trapped on this island. And the monsters, the Titans, are people of their own ethnic group that are basically political dissidents in of the diaspora, of their own diaspora, who are being thrown on that island as political prisoners, and then injected with this serum, or this whatever, that turns them into the Titans. So there's a scene in it where, in the beginning, they hate them. Like, they hate these monsters because, they go through so much suffering. But then towards the scene, like in the middle of the end, the main character sees one of these, and he's like, he feels sympathy for it. And he's like, hey, it's a fellow patriot.
This monster thing.
It's like, yeah, it's a fellow patriot, because he found out, because he knows the truth, that these monsters are actually political dissidents who are fighting on their behalf, who've just been transformed. And then it opens up that there's this whole kind of political alliance against them, that basically there's like a coalition of countries that essentially enforce their imprisonment on this island. And not only that, there's a diaspora of their ethnic group in other countries that live in these like ghettos.
Literal ghettos.
And they live in literal ghettos. So they're like a ghettoized population that produces all these political dissidents who are thrown on this island. And there is a group of they're called the Eldians. There's a group of Eldians who are sympathetic to like the main power country,
the Marlians,
which is called Marley.
Mm-hmm.
And they essentially are kind of like house Eldians. So they do the bidding of, of Marley, and they have the ability to transform into Titans as well, and they use that to serve, the Empire. So then, they go to war. There's, all this stuff about, there's like, spies in the home country that, come to light. It's a crazy story. We're not going to go over the same plot. We're going to go over the different themes, but this is one of the best selling, I guess it's one of the best selling mangas in history, right?
Yep,
So,
it
or
is,
if
yeah.
not the best selling, and maybe the most popular anime ever.
Yep. 100 million copies worldwide. It's a huge success. And it's crazy that it is, because some of the themes are very problematic, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But um, maybe we should also talk a little bit about Carl Schmidt, because I think a lot of this episode is going to center around the themes of the other that Carl Schmidt brings up. So he's, as I said before, a German jurist and a political theorist. He was born in 1888. He was best known for his critique of liberalism and his concept of the political, which centered around, again, the friend-enemy distinction. Now, Schmidt joined the Nazi Party in 1933, and he became a super prominent legal theorist for the regime. And his support for the Nazi ideology and his role in justifying the Führer's state have made his legacy super, super controversial. An example of this is that he provided the legal support by justifying Nazi policies, including one of the more heinous ones, the Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler to rule without parliamentary consent. This is when Hitler really consolidated power and became a full-on dictatorship. Schmidt also defended the Night of the Long Knives, which was a purge of political opponents, by arguing that the Fuhrer was basically above the law. So this guy's not very nice. He's not a very good guy. But a lot of the things he has to say are pretty fascinating, and kind of play out a lot in world history, and certainly play out in Attack on Titan. It's unclear to me whether Asayama, the creator of Attack on Titan, literally lifted a lot of these themes from Schmidt, but it's clear to me that he was a student of history, because a lot of the things that he uses and depicts pretty much feel like pages right out of the history books.
Well, just to give you an example, so in the show, the Eldians that live in ghettos, they literally wear armbands, just like Jews,
with like a star thing on them. Yeah,
with like a star thing. Instead of it being, a Star of David, it has like 8 points instead of 6 points.
Yeah.
So you can't even say, oh, he thought of that on his own. Like, he obviously saw that in a history book, and he's like, oh, I'm going to put this concept in the show.
Yeah, right.
I'm going to make the Eldians Jews.
Right. Which we'll
basically, I'm going to make them
yeah.
Jews. And or at least like borrow heavily from that imagery. And it's funny because you would never be able to publish that or write anything like that in the West.
No.
You'd have to be Japanese you'd have to be removed from like the concept of political correctness to put that into a comic book or a screenplay or whatever, or even just like a book.
Yeah.
But it's so undeniable that the analogy that it's like, yeah, of course he got it from that.
Yeah.
It's just too specific.
All right, back to Schmidt though. So a bit more backstory. He during World War I, he served as a law clerk in the Bavarian First Army's Independent General Command, and then after World War II, Schmidt was arrested by American forces in 1945, and he spent a year in an internment camp. But they later released him because they couldn't pin anything on him. So he was released. He was found not guilty of any specific crimes, so they let him go. And he returned to his hometown of Plettenberg and later lived with his housekeeper, and basically remained an unrepentant Nazi for the remainder of his life. But he was barred from specific academic positions. Despite this, he continued to do studies and He studied international law, and he got a lot of famous visitors, including Ernst Jünger. And in '62, he ended up giving a bunch of lectures in Spain. And in '63, he published a book, The Theory of the Partisan. And then he died a little bit later on April 7th, 1985. So, interesting guy. Not a good guy at all.
Yeah, whatever you think about World War II history, you can't deny that Carl Schmitt had a kind of a profound impact on the zeitgeist, and he was also kind of a product of just 20th century continental politics. I mean, that's what he was a product of, and 20th century continental politics was kind of defined by that sense of, different ethnic groups being forced to live with each other, and the rise of like this more blood and soil type of nationalism. So I mean, he was just a product really of that political culture that was developing on the continent.
Yep.
And it just wasn't this just and I've said this in the past, but
this guy gave me like Machiavelli vibes, like his political theories, at least. It's very like realist, but like fucked up realist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was just kind of like the reality of his day. Mm-hmm. But those that political zeitgeist expanded. We kind of say, oh, well, in the West, meaning like France and Britain, there was civic nationalism, and then everywhere else there was like ethnic nationalism. Mm-hmm. The truth is that kind of expanded pretty much all across the continent. Like that concept of like that ethnos concept, that even, the French, the Vichy government, the French joined the side of the National Socialist. Mm-hmm. I mean, the French resistance wasn't that big of a deal, so that those political ideas were sprawling across all of Europe, with the exception of really Britain.
Right.
So, I mean, that's really just what I have to add on that, is that these ideas were just extremely prevalent at the time.
For sure.
So that's just like the lens I look at Carl Schmitt in.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, maybe we can jump in. So, we wanted to talk about The Other and a lot of Carl Schmitt's theories. And I want to first start off with like that early part of the show, seasons 1 and 2, and kind of talk a little bit about how the Titans were the first other. So when Attack on Titan begins, the enemy is like super obvious. It's these Titans. They were mindless, horrifying, and, seemingly without purpose, except to eat people, right? So they're kind of, in that sense, the perfect enemy, the perfect other. There's no like moral complexity here. It's just survival, right? And
the Titans don't eat for sustenance. They eat just to eat people.
Yep.
So they don't
regardless.
They don't like burn calories or eat for survival. They eat people just
because.
To eat people, just because. There's a reason why they eat people. Yeah. You find it out later, but that's the world that these characters live in. Like these monsters, this just brutally terrorize them, and the main character has his his mother dies, eaten in front of him, and that's what sets him on his quest for revenge.
Right. And now, what's important about this is that the first two seasons is like, where you have to understand it from the framework of like this history timeline, because I think Attack on Titan, even though it only spans, I don't know exactly how many years it spans, but it's definitely a short run. It's less than 13 years because Eren Yeager, when he gets the powers and shit, they can only last for 13 years afterwards. We'll talk more about that later, but it can only be a maximum of 13 years. But it as far as like the framing of the story, this is set in kind of like a medievalish society, right? And it's
a post-industrial society,
right? It's just like it's a small walled city. Well, I shouldn't say it's small; it's fucking massive, right? But that's the whole world for them, and this is the entire frame and the entire context under which we, as the viewer, understand the show. This is the whole world, and the society on Paradise Island, Paradise, it's built around the fear of the Titan. the walled city isn't just like a defense system against them. What we come to learn is that it's actually designed to keep people trapped in the belief that they are the last remnants of humanity. That's the literal brainwashing. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean literally, they were brainwashed into believing that all of humanity collapsed and this is the last bastion of humanity inside of these walls. And the ruling class maintains control over the people through the idea that outside is death, right? And it goes so far because the stratification of the society in Paradise Island is literally and figuratively separated by walls, right? The outermost wall, and I'm forgetting all the wall names. I think it's like Wall Rose, Wall Maria, and Wall something else. The outermost wall is like the peasants, right? The lowest classed system. They're the closest to the Titans. And there's an inner wall of like, upper echelon people. And then the innermost third wall is like all of the highest nobility, the king and everything like that. And the stratification of the society is built around this. And pretty much all that, the only reason why this works is because there's this idea that outside of the walls is just fucking monsters. And it wasn't even an idea. It was like a literal reality, right? So it's quite easy to keep up the appearances. And what we learned throughout the seasons is, inside, there's so much corruption inside of the Paradise Islands that, there's so much wealth disparity. The guard corps in the innermost walls are just busy getting drunk while the ones from the outer walls are out there, fucking fighting Titans and shit and protecting people. And it's all justified. And all this control is justified around the idea that, it's us versus them. It's the people, the Eldians, versus the fucking giant monster things that are outside.
Well, they don't know they're Eldians yet.
Well, they don't know that they're Eldians.
So the concept of nationality doesn't exist to them.
Right. It's just
the first two seasons or
you're
3
exactly
seasons.
Right. You're exactly right. This is just like a human struggle
it's
against
just humanity.
Right. Exactly. Now, this is reflected in Schmidt's first idea that political identity is defined by an enemy. So the existence of the Titans gives the government of Paradise its purpose. So without them, the monarchy might have to answer questions like, why is there so much inequality? Or why is there so much corruption? Or like I said before, why are the military police getting drunk in the streets and not defending the people? Right. And this literally mirrors real world propaganda. I mean, think about how Cold War era America painted the communists as existential threats, or I don't know, medieval European rulers justifying their oppression by blaming the outsiders, like Mongols or Muslims or just generically heretics, right? But where it starts to get really interesting, I think, is the otherness of the Titans doesn't hold up, not for long at least, right? It starts cracking when the main character Aaron transforms into a fucking Titan monster thing, and suddenly the enemy isn't so different from the heroes, right? And, some other characters here, when Reiner and Bertolt reveal themselves as also being Titans, they were the ones who broke down the wall in the first episode. Everything shatters. Like the whole concept of the us versus them breaks down. So if the Titans are no longer the unquestioned enemy, who is? Right? And this kind of brings us to the second part of this, right? The idea of the Survey Corps, or the group of the military group that the main character belongs to that rides outside of the walls to like fight Titans and shit. The Survey Corps now becomes the other. So once the walls leaders realize that the truth is starting to slip out, they pivot, right? And their new enemy becomes the Survey Corps. And Erwin Smith, who is, one of these, giant generals, like he is like the bastion of the fighting force. We'll talk more about him.
Allegedly, he's named after Erwin Rommel.
Yeah, which is interesting. So many parallels there. I definitely think we should talk about. Do you want to talk about that now, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the main good guy general, part of the scouts, the Survey Corps, is named Erwin Smith. So there's these articles online. They're like, oh, well, he named the main general the good guy after Rommel, so he must be a fascist, right? Um, but yeah,
Kind of.
essentially, they
Not really though.
no, he's not. I wouldn't project. I wouldn't project any like politics onto the writer himself. I think he's just writing a story on things that he's grabbed through history, without any type of like political agenda. To really tell kind of a not a simple story, but just like break down some kind of
Actually, I do think it's a simple story, but told in the most complicated possible way.
yeah,
you know.
yeah.
Anyway, but there's so many other parallels of Erwin Smith and Rommel. I mean, they're both renowned and respected military leaders, even among their enemies. Super fast and mobile. Erwin Smith, and if you haven't watched the show and you're not interested, they use this like stuff called ODM gear, which are these like leg mounted. How do I describe this? Leg mounted like fucking zip wires that like shoot off and like allow them to like fucking zip around the map like they're fucking Spider-Man or some shit like that. And then they fly around and they use their swords to cut open the necks of the Titans, and that's how they kill them. Anyway, super highly mobile, right? They use deception tactics and things like that, just like Rommel. Rommel, revolutionized tank warfare in North Africa and used deception tactics and speed to overwhelm opponents even much larger in size and in scale. So there's definitely a lot of parallels there. So I wouldn't necessarily ascribe the fact that Rommel is a Nazi to, like say that the writer is now suddenly fascist, but he definitely drew from this idea of, this kind of well-respected, charismatic, fast-moving general, right? And the biggest parallel I'll get into in just a moment. So Aaron Smith, going back to the anime here, his group goes from heroes, because they're out there fighting the Titans, to traitors basically overnight. And the reason why they become traitors is a few different reasons. One, some of them ended up turning into Titans that broke down the wall. Those guys ended up being spies from the Marlians. We'll talk about that later. But also Aaron, the main character, becomes this like thinking, moving Titan. And, he's a threat now, right? The subtext, and probably the more important reason why the Survey Corps becomes traitors, according to the government, the powers that be, is that they broke the brainwashing. They broke the big lie being that Titans are people and people are Titans, right? And so that really made the ruling class lose grip over the society, and in order to regain that control over society, they needed to turn the enemies, the focus of who is the other, who is the enemy, towards those Survey Corps. And story of Rommel, classically, he ends up having, is forced to commit suicide by Adolf Hitler, right? He became a political opponent of Hitler towards the end and ends up, killing himself for that exact reason. So there's still even further, comparisons between Aaron Smith and Rommel. But yeah, I mean, suddenly that same government that, in Attack on Titan that was preaching about fighting for humanity is now calling their best soldiers criminals, right? And the whole reason why is because they challenged the established narrative. And this is classic authoritarianism. When an external threat no longer works, governments manufacture an internal threat. So take an example, the French Revolution's reign of terror. They turned revolutionaries against each other. Stalin's USSR purged its own people. The US labeled dissenters as communist during McCarthyism. And we can go on and on, right? And Schmidt would say that this is inevitable. He believed that the conflict isn't something to be solved, it's necessary for order. The minute the Titans weren't the clear enemy, the system needed a new enemy to survive. And that brings us to Marley. So a little bit later on, and we're kind of skipping a lot of plot here, but Eventually, our ragtag team of traders figure out that there's a whole nother world outside of this little island that they've been on, right? They've already broken the idea that Titans are evil because now they figured out that people are kind of Titans. And they travel across the sea to, this other fucking continent, and they discover the Marlians, right? And there, for basically 3 seasons, we believe that the people of paradise were the last humans, and now we get to see this other side. So, kind of coming back to what I was saying earlier, we started off as a very small society, and then the whole world starts growing, and quite literally, you see a shit ton of technology. It almost feels like the world has progressed into and past the Industrial Revolution. Over the span of just
they
like
find
a half
themselves
a season.
in like an early 20th century world,
Right.
where it's parallel to like the 1920s or 1930s. Like the warfare that they're fighting is, they don't have planes yet, like they're just inventing planes, but they have like huge blimps as aircrafts,
right?
And
they have giant cannons, and they have like
huge cannons,
guns.
They fight in like trench warfare, so essentially like pre-World War II society.
Right. We're in that intermediary phase. And what's also interesting, another parallel that I just thought of is, this when the scouts and Aaron, the main character, end up in this land. I mean, there's that one scene where they're trying ice cream, and they're like very surprised at all of the cool shit that's in Marley, and it's kind of like when Japan ended their like isolationism practice and realized how fucking far behind the rest of the world they had become. I feel like there's a lot of parallels there, and I can't imagine.
Yeah, there is a huge parallel, because what Paradise Island does is that they undergo a rapid industrialization process. So they start kidnapping. So these are like the heroes of the main protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
They start kidnapping like engineers and just like people from Marley, and making them give them their technology.
Right.
They're like, okay, like you need to teach us how to build a railroad.
Mm-hmm.
You need to teach us how to build a port. And then there's other countries that are antagonistic with Marley, who will are helping them create a modern infrastructure.
That's right. And Marley is this powerful empire that basically has conquered the world. And how they did this is fucked up. Basically, they knew the secret to the Titans, and they used them as weapons. The secret is, and I'm going to butcher this, so I'm going to make it as simple as possible. Basically, if you are an Eldian, you have this genetic predisposition to become a Titan. And there is a group of like 8 Titans that are not mindless people eater creatures, right? And the way to become one of these not mindless people eaters was to eat the last not mindless Titan. So basically they figured out, all right, they can take the spinal fluid of this one Titan guy and inject it into an Eldian, who would then become a mindless Titan, and then they would feed the old thinking Titan to the mindless Titan, and then the mindless Titan would become the new thinking Titan. And so what's crazy about this is that we're going to think about like this situation where we're in like early 20th century-ish time period. Imagine if during World War I or before World War I, you as a country had the ability to summon 100-foot monster things. Like, how do you even fight against that? Even like cannons and guns, like, doesn't kill them. They're like basically immune to everything. You blow off an arm and it'll grow right back. The only way to kill them is to kill the human being that's kind of like stuck inside the back of the neck of the Titan, and only very skilled people know how to do that. Basically, this is like the equivalent in this time period and in this context of like a thermonuclear bomb, right? You have nukes and nobody can stop you. And so they use these titans to basically conquer a large swath of the world. And then what now? Their enemy isn't just the island of Marlians, of Eldians. It's literally the Eldians that are living among them. Remember how Henry was saying there's a group of these Eldians in Marley that are living in ghettos, and they are marked with those armbands. It's super reminiscent of Nazi Germany. And the whole education system and, propaganda system in Marley is teaching everyone that Eldians are the devil and that they're inherently dangerous. And only by serving Marley can they redeem themselves. That is the Eldians. So you get a small group of Eldians who want to work with the Marlians for better lives for themselves and for their families, right? And so they'll volunteer to be these living weapons. And this is quite literally how power structures sustain themselves, by keeping, the oppressed fighting among themselves. Then there's that scene. There's a thinking titan. His name is Zeke, who later we find out is the half brother of our main character, Aaron. Zeke, in one of these scenes, it's a flashback, basically snitches on his parents for being like dissidents. And in so doing, solidifies himself, because remember, he was, brainwashed and propagandized in this way, solidifies himself as one of the good Eldians, right, that are working for their side. And he becomes one of these thinking titans as a result. So the Nazis did this by forcing Jews into ghettos, obviously. Apartheid South Africa did it by making black South Africans turn against each other in all of these different class struggles. Marley needed to do this, and needed to do this to the Eldians to keep them subjugated. Kind of in the background, Zeke has this different solution. So Zeke, what we later learn to be the half-brother of our protagonist, Aaron, he comes up with a euthanasia plan, and he internalizes the enemy. So Zeke sees the truth, which is that as long as Eldians exist, they will always be seen as enemies. And his solution isn't to rise up and, save everyone, save all the Eldians. His solution is to wipe them out. Like a self-hating Eldian.
Yeah, a self-hating Eldian. Yeah. But he wants to wipe them out by sterilizing them.
That's right. And not like a medical practice sterilizing. There's some magic happening in the background that I don't...
Yeah, there's some weird Japanese anime stuff that happens.
Yeah, it's just magic, right?
There's a trick. Accept it. But the concept is he wants to sterilize them all.
Right. So that...
through this process that only makes sense in their universe. But...
right.
It wouldn't be like a violent death. They just slowly die out as a race.
Exactly. And he actually thinks that he's being like a savior to the Eldians, because his idea, this is a philosophical concept called antinatalism. And I'm gonna butcher this, so bear with me. It's been 15 or more years since I studied philosophy. So antinatalism is like the idea that suffering is a necessary part of life. And so therefore, if you have children, then you are making the conscious decision to give suffering to your child by simply creating them. Right? It's kind of a fucked up premise, but it's logically sound. And so the idea that an antinatalist would say is you shouldn't have children, because by necessity, if you have children, they are going to suffer in some way or shape or form. And so the just thing to do is not to have children. Right? And this is exactly what's going on in Zeke's head. Zeke thinks the Eldians are constantly suffering. And the only way for me to stop the suffering is to just make it so that Eldians never were born. And by, sterilizing all the Eldians, he believes even broader than saving the Eldians. He also believes that he can end the cycle of war. If there are no more Eldians, then there are no more Titans, and therefore no more fear, and also no more Eldians, right? And Schmidt would call this the final conclusion of enemy logic. If the only way is to ensure peace is to remove the other, then eventually someone's going to try. And in history, we've seen this logic used for genocide, right? So think Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the Armenian genocide, you name it, right? So it's just a crazy fucking concept. And I'm going to talk about how Aaron, our main protagonist, sees this in a minute, but I just want to get your reaction on Zeke's idea.
Yeah, I mean, when I was watching it, I was like, man, this guy, I fucking hated him. I was like, this guy's like, he's trying, what a traitor. So
yeah,
the real interesting thing about this show is that, so you're building on this society, and you start to just empathize with them or sympathize with them so much because of all the suffering they go through, and that being the Eldians.
Mm-hmm.
So you really start to take their side in the show. And when Zeke starts talking about this euthanization project, you're like, fuck this guy.
Yeah.
And it makes it seem that, so the protagonist pretends like he's going to go along with the plan, but he has his own plan. And essentially his plan is to just essentially have like a Samson option type thing, mm-hmm. where they are able to convert their wall into Titans, into these weapons of mass destruction, essentially, to march on the world. Mm-hmm. So the solution from the people of Paradise, the Eldians who are stuck on this island, is to carry out a mass genocide. Just
against the entire
mass
world.
Genocide of billions of people around the world.
Yeah, he said because 80% of the world. Way. Yeah.
Well, that's what they end up taking. That's what they end up killing, but their plan was to kill everyone outside of the island.
Right. So
they reached the conclusion, and these are the main characters, they reached the conclusion that the only way to solve their problem for this, against this global alliance that's set against them, is to activate this like Samson option to do this massive genocide against mm-hmm. everyone else. It's called the Rumbling, mm-hmm. where basically they summon these huge colossal Titans and march on the earth. And it's super fucking cool in the show.
Yeah, it looks amazing.
I mean, it looks fucking cool as hell. It's a cool poster. And you also are like, you're like, yeah, that's way better. Like as a viewer, you're just like, okay, yeah, I sympathize. I rather them go with that plan. Like I'm taking their side to do the genocide rather than euthanize themselves.
Really,
that's just so humiliating.
We can defer on this one. I don't. Even when I was watching it, I was like exceptionally upset that of all of the possible outcomes, this is the one that the main character. I mean, he literally decides to turn full Hitler and just kill everybody. Well, that's the genius of the show, is that it puts you in a moral dilemma. Mm-hmm. That at the end, when he's carrying out these, and it's not just Aaron, most of the country supports him. Yeah,
in doing
most of Paradise becomes these.
Most of Paradise Island supports. So
they literally become Nazis.
So they become there's like a faction that supports the main hero's plan to do this genocide called the Jaegerist. And they essentially adopt this, and it's like 100% parallel with like these national movements, these hardcore nationalist movements in the 20th century during World War II or like pre-World War II, that they become very militaristic, and essentially they become very parallel or even fascist. Like that would probably be an accurate depiction.
Yeah, 100% fascist. Yeah,
where even just like the aesthetics of them. So they start adopting like the last scene. One of the last scenes of the show is that it shows how far that Paradise Island evolved, and they actually look like National Socialists. They look like the German army. Mm-hmm. They look like the Wehrmacht, mm-hmm. marching on the street. So it you get into a moral dilemma because you're sympathizing with this society so much that you don't want to see them go through this kind of humiliating ritual or this humiliating process to euthanize themselves, to sterilize themselves, because you want to see them catch a break, really.
Yeah.
So you're put in a moral dilemma of, do I want them to, overcome this or not? So when Aaron announces his plan to do the genocide, there's a part of you, and I'm not the only viewer, who's like, fuck yeah. Yeah, like hell yeah. Like, stop taking their shit.
Yeah.
Because you sympathize with them so much
right.
during the show, because you've seen them go through so much suffering. You want to see them kind of overcome these like horrible odds. And the way it's presented, and the truth is that the options that they're given at towards the end of the show is that they're going to face a genocide themselves, to make it very clear that the rest of the world is going to attack the island to finally end the the Eldian problem for good.
What is that? What is that line? I think it's like from The Dark Knight. It's like, you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. What was it? You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And that's literally what happens to Aaron. It's fucking crazy.
Well, yeah. So he starts to carry out this plan, and like you said, he wipes out 80% of humanity in the process.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when he's actually carrying out the mass genocide, you're like, oh, okay, I didn't sign up for this.
Yeah.
But
yeah, because it's pretty graphic.
They're like announcing their plans to do it. You're like, you know what? I kind of want them to. I'm kind of like this option more than the other option.
It's kind of like a false choice. I mean, they could have went with like a mutually assured destruction kind of thing. Like, you don't fuck with us and we don't fuck with you, you know?
The truth is, though, is that they came up with this conclusion after like one delegation.
Yep.
Because another option that they had, that they were talking about doing, is they were going to do like a mini rubbling.
Right.
Do you remember that part? Like,
I do.
We'll do just a mini, like a small, and everyone supports this.
A small genocide, you know?
Like, we're going to do a small rumbling as a deterrence threat.
Right.
To just show our deterrence, so no one else will attack us. And they say like 60 years. Like, we'll be safe for the century once the world sees our deterrence, that we can just do like a mini genocide.
Right. Kind of like when the U.S. drops the nuke.
That's like the logical plan.
Mm-hmm.
The main protagonist gives up on doing the mini genocide and goes with the full-on genocide. But the thing is, though, is that I will say this. Here's like the one weakness in the story. They only made like one peace delegation trip, because he comes up with the idea of doing it when like they go to Marley, and they go to like a their version of the UN, and every single country's like is basically like waving their fist and like pumping their chest for war with the island. And he's like, okay, we can't reason with these people, so let's just go with the genocide option.
That's when he gets the Warhammer Titan, right?
What's that?
That's when he gets the Warhammer Titan power. That shit was so cool.
Well, that was before, leading up to it. But they probably could have made a couple more more of an effort.
Yeah,
to make peace, but I mean, that would have just taken more, I guess, pages in the manga. So they just went with, all right, we're just going to skip that, and he's going to come to the realization that they needed to do the genocide right away, just to catch the point. But nevertheless, they reached that conclusion.
Right.
So
and at the end of the show, so basically it's like I still don't quite understand it, because it's been a minute since I did, but there's a lot of theories.
Let's not bother doing the time travel stuff, because we're not going to be able to explain
let's
that.
Let's not even talk about that. That's the fancy magic of anime. I'm talking more about how, Aaron, and the theory that he was an anti-hero, basically he does this. This is the theory. He does this super genocide because he knows that his friends are going to come and stop him, right? And by stopping him, they become the heroes that saved, the world, kind of, and makes everyone realize that, like, hey, these aliens aren't that bad. right? Like, look, even they'll stop themselves from doing a genocide. Now, the irony is that, first of all, he successfully kills 80% of everyone. And kind of the shitty part about the ending is that he kills 80% of the world, but somehow all of the characters that we know and love, save for like a handful that died earlier, are still alive. Like, ironically, right? Um, and the second irony, and probably the biggest irony, is that his plan doesn't work. You see in the end credits that his actions create the exact scenario he was trying to escape. And what that is that when you're watching the end credits, it turns out that this is kind of hard to follow. You have to like really pay attention, but the special magical tree that created the Titans in the first place pops up again. Some new Eldian ends up in there anyway. And so the cycle of Titans continues until eventually Paradise Island, after many, many years and many generations, gets nuked. That's the final solution. It just gets nuked to smithereens, and that's the fucking end of the show. So even after murdering 80%.
I think you're misreading that, though.
Huh?
I think you're misreading the ending. So the ending is, I don't think it shows you that that was a consequence of his action, Paradise Island getting nuked. What it shows is that, so the end credits pop up and it actually shows Paradise Island becoming like, essentially evolving into an industrial society and then a modern society with like modern skyscrapers and then a futuristic society. And then it's nuked. So
yeah,
we're talking about
I'm not
probably
saying that Aaron's actions and that nuking was a direct result, but what I'm trying to say is that he didn't stop the cycle of violence. War ultimately still continued after he was gone. And also if you look into the thing, like Titans were still a thing.
Well, what he says at the end is that he has like 5 different reasons for carrying out the genocide. And what he says at the very end is like, at the end of the day, I just wanted to do this. And
he just felt like
he got so fucked up in that. And it's believable in the premise because he actually is going through like significant mental trauma.
Right. I mean, his mom died. He was tortured a lot.
But also like the different powers that he's developing are fucking with his head.
Right.
So he did it mainly for himself. Like the thing about his friends becoming like international heroes, he admits in it that wasn't really the reason why he did it. Like that was like a bullshit reason he thought of. And that, the real reason is just because he kind of had that. He says at the end, it's like, I'm just a guy who came in, I'm just like a mediocre guy who came into a lot of power. And this was the best solution I can come up with. And that's his reasoning. And it makes sense in the context of the show after like seeing where he starts and where the character develops. What do you think? Do you agree with that? Or
yeah, I mean, I do. I guess what I'm trying to say is though that his solution was trash. His solution was absolute trash, and it didn't work. It wasn't a solution.
Well, I think it did kind of. I mean, Paradise Island wasn't nuked for like, I don't know. It looked like 1,000 years into the future.
Well, timescales on this were so fucked up, so I have no idea how long it was.
It seemed like 1,000 years into the future. So, I mean, he stopped the cycle of violence
for a little while.
for a significant amount of time. Right, and
we also don't
history,
see
like maybe it's a different country.
Like it's literally just end credits where we learn all of this stuff, which is kind of frustrating because we don't get to see the society that blooms thereafter. We don't get to see what kind of like world it is. We don't get to see is this like a Jaegerist run world? Is this do they turn a chapter and become more liberal? Like what is it that they do? And more importantly, and kind of along the lines,
you're supposed to leave that up. That's supposed to be left up to interpretation.
Exactly. So it's a little bit genius, but at the same time, what I'm trying to say is going back to my comparison with Carl Schmitt's ideology is that Carl Schmitt would argue, if he watched the show, that there must have been some other enemy that they developed right? Some other that they created to unify the peoples, because otherwise the society would have collapsed in on itself. And at least from that very last scene, that very last, nuclear explosion, it's clear that they did have some enemy, and that enemy nuked the shit out of them, right? So it's, in a way, I don't know if the Isayama is critiquing Carl Schmidt or if he's confirming Carl Schmidt, or
I
maybe
think what
both.
he's saying, I think the message I got from the ending was that no matter what you do, the cycle of violence is going to continue.
Yeah,
And
I get that
he
too.
doesn't, there's no context into, like, you don't even know if because they call themselves the Eldian Empire at
Mm-hmm.
the end.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't even know if the Eldian Empire has it's like it's even the same country as
Mm-hmm.
before. It could be a completely different country with different borders and all of that. It's
Right.
so far into the future. It most likely is, given the advancements in technology that the time lapse and the credits runs through. So I think the point was that no matter what, there's always going to be violence, and there's always going to be kind of like a cyclical nature to even civilization that eventually your run's going to end, and violence will continue, and eventually your society will crumble. But I do get a sense that when you first see that scene, you're like, oh man, they got nuked at the end. They did something to deserve that, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't know what the fuck did they do to you kind of feel. I got a sense that they before thinking about it, I was like, oh, they probably had that nuke coming for something they did.
Well, I'm thinking that the something they did was destroy 80% of the fucking world. And again, the reason why I feel that way is because technically we don't know how much time elapses in those end credits, but um, if you look at the pace at which Paradise Island, modernizes in the last season, it's very possible that this isn't a matter of 1,000 years. Maybe it's 60 years, like how the original mini genocide plan was proposing. Maybe it's only 60 years later. I mean, when you think about 60 years ago to now, we've evolved very quickly. I'd argue that we're a futuristic society, very, very much like in the end scene of Attack on Titan. This might have just been a 60-year thing.
It could have been. I mean, that's the beauty of art that's left to interpret. You can interpret that as whatever time span. But you could take either message that it was like a cyclical thing, or it was like a direct action of the rumbling, or it could be something completely different.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been some different geopolitical dispute they got into that led to them getting nuked. But again, this is like end credits, so it's not the core of the story.
Right.
It's kind of like it's an epilogue type thing.
Mm-hmm. And there's no dialogue, and it's literally credits, right? Like you see the credits happening while you see these scenes happening. Like both satisfying and unsatisfying at the same time for me.
I mean, I was kind of satisfying. And then after the nuke, you see like a kid go into the tree, and I mean, this is the magic aspect of it, so we won't get into it. But
Right.
So let's talk about some more parallels,
Okay.
because I think there's different different analogies that you can make, and I was going down the rabbit hole to see what people have been writing about it, or what have people said about the ending over the past 2 years, or when did the anime end? Last year,
23, so 2 years. Yeah.
so 2 years ago. And so one way to interpret it with just historical analogies, and again, I think it's a mistake to do this, but it's fun nevertheless to think of like, oh, what were the historical analogies that he was using, and like what was
Right.
how can you interpret it? I think it's always a mistake to project, unless they like overtly say it, their politics. I think it's a mistake to project politics on a writer or a fiction writer
Mm-hmm.
specifically. But one way is that the Eldians are Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So the Eldians are a persecuted ethnic group who are blamed for past atrocities, and they're confined to ghettos. And the Marleyan government uses anti-Eldian propaganda to justify their opposition. So the Eldians in Paradise, they develop a nationalist response, very akin to Zionism, by seeking a homeland where they can govern themselves without outside, influence or the threat of, being annihilated. A safe place for Eldians. And the rumbling, and I said this before, is, it's kind of the same thing as the Israeli Samson option.
Right. No,
But then again, the Samson option is like more of like, if we go down, we're taking you down with us type of thing.
Right.
It's not
it's a defensive option.
It's like a dead hand switch type thing where
Right.
if you try to destroy Israel, we're going to, take everyone else down with us, rather than we're going to, what's the word I'm looking for? Proactively, or
offensively.
What's the offensively, or just, use this,
preemptively.
use this as like, preemptively. We're going to use this preemptively. Which the Eldians did use the rumbling preemptively.
Yeah, I think the criticism I see of that view is that the Eldians in this story were actually oppressors in the past. Like, there's this whole, 1,000-year timeline from the before times that shows that there's this old Eldian empire that, basically took over the entire planet with the power of the Titans, just like the Marleyans did thereafter. And, they were actually fucked up. Unlike Jewish people today, that are historically a persecuted minority group that don't have an empire and didn't do the fucked up things that the Eldians actually did. And, the Marleyans were previously ruled by the Eldians, whereas in real history, Jews were never really in a position of global dominance. Although, if you're on the fringe, you'd probably argue against me, but realistically, not really in a position of global dominance. Not like the Eldians were in Attack on Titan.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. But you could certainly come, the whole like them creating this kind of this solution to their persecution is to create this like hyper nationalistic state. That's where the analogy is I think more solid.
Yeah, pretty strong. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're a persecuted group, so in their defense, they set up this state that has the ability to protect them.
Right.
Essentially, that's where the parallel is. Another parallel is that you can look at this from as the Eldians as Germans.
Right, which is kind of an oxymoron. Right?
Yeah, well, I'm not the only one who says this, but
of course, yeah.
A lot of historians say that National Socialism, Zionism, and also like Soviet communism were all created in the same dialectical process of each other.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not there's similarities between all three, and if you look at it from like, all right, the Eldians are Germans, you can look at like the Treaty of Versailles. So after losing World War I, they're essentially blamed for everything for the war.
Mm-hmm.
And the Allied powers are basically a allegory for, essentially, they don't have like a name for it, I think, in the show, or maybe they do and I just missed it, but it's called like a global alliance, or like the International Alliance.
Right.
Are going to be the ones who are invading Paradise. So, that's how the National Socialists framed their war, is that it's us against the literal, it was really them against the entire world when you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Considering that they were fighting both you know, the British Empire, the United States,
The Russian
and the
Empire.
Soviet Union. And you can equate, I mean, literally the Eldians, when they start advancing, they look like the Wehrmacht.
Mm-hmm.
Like I sent you a picture of like one of the last pictures of their army.
Yep.
And it's like literally like they, he probably traced a picture of the Wehrmacht to
yeah.
to
It certainly
to write
looks
them.
like that.
So there's another way to look at it. And then there's like, he's Japanese, so I'm sure he used Japanese history as a way, as a way to tell the story, or as an allegory as well, where Japan is well, I mean, just the whole concept of them being this island, and then they come in contact with other societies, and they rapidly advance. Like that's very kind of Meiji restorationist type view.
Oh yeah.
Then I was reading these articles from like Polygon, which is like the big video game website.
Mm-hmm.
And they're super liberal and progressive. So like there was all these writers who are like, oh well, just Attack on Titan is a fascist propaganda.
Yeah, dude, I encountered hours of YouTube videos on that topic. It's crazy.
And I mean, I think you're just looking for things to complain about if you watch that show and you come out with like, this guy is putting out fascist propaganda. I mean, it's clearly kind of like, I don't know if it's like a direct critique of any political movement, but I
don't think it's a critique or a
it's like it's a study on
just
like
commentary.
The human condition.
Yeah, it's just like,
yeah,
he like picked and chose a lot of really important, thematic topics from world history and included them as very intricate and very interesting, subtext in this manga, in this anime. And he did it masterfully, in my opinion. I think he did a fantastic job of making those parallels and really making you think about some of these concepts in a way that wasn't necessarily super prescriptive, right? Like you're kind of left to choose your own side, right? Like when we were texting, you were like, "Oh yeah, I probably would have been a Jaegerist at that point," right? Like I don't know.
Oh yeah, I did say that.
I would, but
it was that me texting you my thoughts. That was like my raw feel. Like that was close. That was the closest to my raw feelings while watching it. I was like, yeah, right. I would be. I think I texted that to you while I was still watching. It's like I would definitely be a Jaegerist if I was born in that society.
Right.
So, there's a scene where there's basically Aaron's friends backstab him, and they turn on the Jaegerist. And it's like a painful scene.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the most painful scene in the show.
Yeah.
For me, because they're essentially like turning on their brethren who they were fighting the Titans with. Mm-hmm. And now they're actively like killing them. And you're like, man, these fucking traitors, these fucking race traitors.
But they don't do so lightly either. They do so with extreme trepidation. Like it's a fucking heart-wrenching decision that they make to do this, and as the viewer, you also have to wrestle with that concept. Like, if I'm in this situation, do I go ahead and kill my comrades at arms, my best friends, just because they share different political opinions?
Well, I think it wasn't that they shared different political opinions. It was that they were going to actively carry out a genocide.
Well, yeah,
that they wanted to stop.
I'd argue that's a difference of political opinion, just at a greater scale. You know what I mean? Because to the people for the Jaegerists, that made sense, right? They felt like they were oppressed, that this is the only way to save our people. They were full-throated, drank the Kool-Aid, 100%, nationalists or ethno-nationalists or whatever you want to call them, and from their perspective, that was the correct way to go.
well, there's a scene where the head Jaegerist is like pleading with them. It's like, please, like, you need to let us carry out this plan because the Global Alliance is going to kill every single man, woman, and child on
Mm-hmm.
this island if we don't do it. And you know that. And
Mm-hmm.
like, you're thinking, like, yeah, man, he's probably right.
Right.
Like they probably are going to suffer like a catastrophe if they don't carry this out.
Right.
So again, it does put you, I think, better than, I don't know if there's like another show that put me in a moral dilemma like this show, where you're like, man, it really, I don't know, I really don't know who to side with on this.
Yeah.
Like who do I sympathize more with? Like, obviously the genocide, carrying out the genocide is, it's going to be morally wrong to 95% of people are like, okay, that's going too far. But then you're like, yeah, but these people have just suffered so much, and like they're making
Right.
a good point. Like, if I was in their shoes and it was like me against them,
Yeah. You and your
I
children
would,
versus them.
yeah,
Yeah.
me and my children versus everyone else. I would, pick me and my children.
Mm-hmm.
So you completely understand where they're coming from. Um, so it's like, I mean, that's good writing. Yeah.
Yeah.
At the end of the day,
Yeah. It
that's
really
really
is.
good writing because they don't, there's like different levels of writing like morally gray characters in like the case of the Game of Thrones. You read Game of Thrones or the Ballad of Ice and Fire or a Song of Ice and Fire,
Mm-hmm.
excuse me. And they George R. R. Martin writes like morally great characters
Right.
where Jamie, for example, is like the perfect example where he does all this heinous shit, but he has like these redeeming qualities and he has like this redemption arc. However, he still, even though he has this redemption, the actions that he carries out are are horrible. Like there's
Right.
no question about the
They're
actions that he
grossly
carries out are
selfish. Yeah.
evil. They're grossly, yeah, they're grossly selfish, and there's no like, you're not like seeing, you're not looking at Jamie and you're like, oh yeah, that was like, if I was in Jamie's position, I would have threw out the boy out the window
Right.
if he saw me, in an incestuous relationship with my sister. I've like, you can't.
Yeah. You
It's like
can't put
harder to
yourself in
put
his
yourself
shoes.
in his shoes.
Yeah.
You're just like, okay, he is sorry for what he did, and like you can understand how he came to those decisions, given like the life he lived, but like still the actions that he took were unforgivable. And there's like plenty of other characters in Game of Thrones like that where they've done heinous stuff, but like they're complex, and there's some redeeming things that they've done as well, which makes them complex characters. But in this show, you literally are like thinking like, man, is that action the correct action? Like, if I
Mm-hmm.
was in my shoes, would I do that? If I was really presented in the us or them type, if I was presented in like that us or them situation, um, and it's really it's hard to, it's difficult to grasp like what you would do. Like it's difficult to like judge those situations in like the moral context
Right.
when you put yourself in their shoes.
I think the biggest disservice and where I can see some of the arguments about um, Isayama promoting fascism in Attack on Titan is that he doesn't spend near he offers a false choice for a solution, right? False choice being like he gives you two options, both of them are bad. You have to pick one or the other. When there's like, I mean, we've talked about it right now. Like there's clearly more options. Um, I think if there's a weakness to this story in terms of if we're arguing about whether or not
Like the
this
mini genocide was an
exactly
option.
mini genocide was an option, or you didn't even need to do a mini genocide. You could just do show of force, right? Like I think about this a lot when we think if we've talked about this on the show when we are talking about like whether or not it was morally permissible to drop the nuke on Japan. And we talked a lot about how Japan was going to fall either way. Was it entirely necessary? And the fact that dropping the nuke on Japan was less about making Japan submit and more about flexing on the Soviet Union to make sure that they understood that we've got these bombs and you can't fuck with us and like stay in line. I think about it that way a lot, and I just think about like couldn't they have just summoned a shit ton of colossal titans and posted them outside of the country and be like, "Yo, we're having a chat," you know? Or you pointed it out masterfully. It's something I hadn't noticed because it's been a minute since I watched the show, but you're absolutely right. They had one peace talk. That's it. One, right? Like, I mean, with the stakes that high, when the options are, you know, fucking genocide the world to save the Eldians, or don't genocide the world so that you could be genocided against eventually. Like, those are shit options. Like, and especially in the context of like how many conflicts we have right now, like ongoing right now, I think the role of diplomacy really needs to be highlighted more. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of this story is that maybe it isn't a weakness. Maybe it's just a reflection of reality that we need to be talking more, right? It doesn't have to be this false dichotomy of like kill or be killed, There are
In the
third and
defense,
fourth and fifth options.
in the defense of the Jaegers, though, they were preemptively attacked at the end.
Yeah. I mean, no one's arguing against defending yourself. At least I'm
Like
not.
the guy, so you know how the one guy who was like who was making that speech and then he was eaten.
Well,
You know what I'm talking about?
yeah,
When they
wasn't
did
he
that.
he was an Eldian, and wasn't he arguing to kill the Eldians though?
Yeah, so he was an Eldian, but he was a kind of like,
One of those
I
self-hating
mean, this is
Eldians.
another yeah, this is like another historical allegory of like the of like the Jew who runs things behind the you know the
The scenes.
yeah, who runs things behind the scenes. So he was like a noble, an Eldian noble, but he maintained good relations with the government, with the Marleyan government, and he was he had all this power, and he was like a an aristocrat. So he was making a speech about how they need to preemptively attack Paradise Island because they're going to do the rumbling.
Mm-hmm.
And then midway through the speech, that's when the Jaegerists attack them.
Yeah.
But he didn't know the Jaegers were going to attack him at the time. I guess actually he did know. All right. Well,
A little fuzzy.
there's different ways you can look at it. I have to rewatch that scene, but yeah, I get your point. Like there was in the sake in if you were really in that context, if you were trying to make a diplomatic solution, it didn't really make that much effort, or they did have a false choice of like either doing the genocide or
dying.
Or dying. Maybe they could have done the
Euthanization.
the mini genocide. Yeah. Well, that wasn't a choice. That wasn't like a real choice. Doing the euthanization or the sterilization.
That was dying light.
Yeah. So I had this article just going back to the criticism that I saw of it. So I pulled this thing from Polygon. For the far right, or alt-right to be specific, Attack on Titan is a story that very shrewdly normalizes the white supremacist ideology for a mainstream audience. In the alt-right eyes, the Eldians are a stand-in for white people in Western countries, punished for the crimes of their ancestors. Their lands are now occupied by besieged monsters. The weak Eldians are brainwashed by a state leader who calls for pacifism and nonviolence against non-Eldians. These weak Eldians represent the white population indoctrinated by liberals in order to feel empathy for non-whites. In Marley, the country represents Jews, convincing the white people to hate themselves. So that was something from Polygon.
Okay.
And and hey, I'm sure there's some like weirdos on Reddit, or not Reddit, 4chan, who've written stuff like that, but come on, like that wasn't, I think most people watching that, unless they're already like, some weird fucking white supremacist,
that's not what they see out of it. Yeah.
That's not the conclusion that they're making. Like you really have to, I think that's a reach. If anything, right. I think the two closest allegories are either, I mean, there's two ones that I think are kind of blatant. Germany and Jews. And I mean, you couldn't be more blatant with the
I mean, it
historical
was
analogy.
literally wearing the
I saw some people
armbands.
criticizing. Some people were criticizing the use of the armband, saying it was just like untasteful, like it was without taste to do that. And you could make the argument that maybe it was a little insensitive to blatantly just pull that from history and publish that in your book. But I mean, it was it other than that, I mean, I don't think there was really that much that was controversial about the show, unless you're nitpicking. So I think the one thing I did see though is that the writer, Isayama, he had I read this blog where they were like going deep into his tweets, and allegedly he based one of the characters, or he did base one of the characters off this Japanese general. But this Japanese general was pre World War II and like pre 1930. So if you look at Japanese history, when they started to kind of adopt this like fanatic nationalism, that started to develop a lot more in like the 1930s. This general was prevalent in like the late 1800s and the early, like during the first Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, and he was like, basically just a military leader. Mm-hmm. He wasn't really a political figure. In the 1930s, after the 1930s, the military and the political leadership basically becomes synonymous. Like the military basically takes over the government. Mm-hmm. And there's all these like crazy secret societies and stuff like that. That kind of hijacked the state. That was pre this guy's era. I think to most Japanese people, he's just, he was a very successful general who helped modernize the army. So obviously nationalist groups kind of like hijacked his image.
Yeah, but I mean, the Koreans accused this guy of being a war criminal. So, he's not.
Well, I don't know. He wasn't in terms of like military affairs. The general we're talking about is Akiyama, Yusufuru Akiyama. He was a Japanese cavalry general, mm-hmm. and the advancements he made were like strictly for the cavalry. And he had retired from the military by the time the Japanese had occupied not Korea at the time, not South Korea, and so I don't know the history of his involvement. I think he may have served in like the administrative apparatus that governed Korea at the time. Mm-hmm. But I don't know like the link of him in atrocities against Koreans. I mean, the Japanese, we did an episode on this. The Japanese did definitely carry out atrocities against Koreans.
Yep.
When they colonized it.
Yeah.
Even pre World War II, like they would shoot protesters and stuff on site. Like they did some bad shit, but I don't know the extent of his involvement in any crimes like that. But there was another tweet that he wrote that this allegedly, was all over South Korean news, where he basically, man, I have this. Do I have this drawn up? I got to read it, because you'll find it pretty funny. So somebody had said that called the Japanese Nazis. And he wrote back, I believe that categorizing the Japanese soldiers who were in Korea before Korea was a country as Nazis is quite crude. Also, I do not believe that the people whose populations were increased twofold by Japanese unification of the country can be compared to people who experienced the Holocaust. This type of miscategorization is a source of misunderstanding and discrimination.
Wow. Okay.
Which I found kind of funny, because they're saying like, hey, the Japanese committed all these war crimes in Korea. And he's saying, well, war crimes. Well, in fact, the Korean population increased.
Yeah.
During Japan's occupation.
It's kind of
industrialized Korea.
It's kind of a fucked up take,
Well, it reminds me of the take when you're like, hey man, the the Israelis are carrying out a genocide against the Arabs.
Right.
And they're like,
Gaza,
oh, excuse me, genocide? Well, let me tell you something. The Palestinian population has tripled since Israel's existence.
Right.
So how is that a genocide? And you're
Right.
like, all right, come on. Like, obviously the population growth is going in a direction.
Right.
And the population would be growing regardless, just due to, regular advancements in modern society. And that's why the Korean population, increased. And it is true, though, the Japanese did modernize Korea.
Sure. But for their own
absolutely
gain,
did.
not
Korea
for
was
theirs.
backwater. Korea was kind of like a backwater country.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, it's like, well, South Korea wasn't even a country
Right.
at the time.
That's like,
which brings you another another
parallel.
thing that, like, Zionist types will
Palestine
be like,
isn't even a country.
let me see the records. Well, this coin actually is from the Ottoman Empire, so no currency, no country.
Right.
And you're saying that you have rights to, like, it's kind of reminds me of that argument.
It's a very crass argument, and what I think it does the worst. This is really what makes Isayama, the writer of Attack on Titan, kind of problematic, is that that kind of argument sweeps under the rug all of the atrocities that were committed in the name, that Japan did on Korea, right? So, you can make this kind of like after the fact, hindsight is 2020 argument that, yeah, well, their population doubled and they became industrialized and unified. Like, yeah, okay, at what cost? Right? And would they have done this? Would their population have grown without the atrocities? Would they have been able to industrialize without the Japanese occupation? It's obviously an unanswerable question, but it's the argument is just so fucked up that
there's
ignore
this meme,
the issue.
there's this meme that's hilarious, that it's like a German guy, a Japanese guy, and it's like, I don't know what the third guy was. It was either like Russian or Ukrainian. And the German guy is like, we're so sorry for committing war crimes. And then the Japanese guy is like, we didn't commit any war crimes. And then the Russian guy is like, my grandfather committed war crimes, proudly. Like, yes, my grandfather committed those war crimes. But I don't really care about his take on Korean unification that much. I just think that was funny.
Mm-hmm.
That, that is kind of like part of Japanese political culture is that they do deny a lot of the
bad shit
the
that
war
they did.
crimes that they've been accused of during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
Which it causes a lot of tension between them and China and Korea, who were, some of the primary victims. But that's an argument for another day, really.
Yep. All right. I think it's getting late. We should probably wrap this one up.
Yeah, let's wrap it up. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, for those who stuck around. If you like this episode and you want us to do more kind of kind of pop culture type stuff, like historical analogies of like other series, there's another show, Vinland Saga, that I watched that was pretty, would make good content. But like anything else that you think of that we should watch, that we could do a similar series on, let us know if you liked it, and we'll do more if the response is positive.
Yep.
Danny, anything else?
Nope.
All right, guys. If you like the show, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast, rate and review the show, and then join our Substack as well. And we will see you later.
Peace.